Hey, it's Jordan. I am in Flint, Michigan, East Palestine, Ohio,
Tumwa, Iowa.
Please support the only independent outlet on the ground covering what the corporate media covers up. Hey, it's Jordan with Status Coup. 72 hours after the Democratic Party lost again to a used car salesman, Democratic Party officials and their accomplices in the corporate media are parading themselves on CNN, MSNBC, and in the pages of the New York Times to express all the wrong lessons learned for why they lost to Trump, essentially to lie to you once again. But there was a unbelievably illuminating and eye-opening column written by David Brooks of the New York Times, who is one of these, highly overpaid, highly intellectual, snooty, out of touch, cosmopolitan columnists that basically are fixtures in corporate media. He's been wrong pretty much forever about everything, but he actually expressed that we were right about everything, only he expressed it a decade too late. Let me read this, and this video might be a little longer than other ones, but I hope you'll stick with me because this is just illuminating and stunning, and there is a method to why I want to go through this extensively. This is the New York Times, David Brooks, one of their, highly overpaid gas bag columnists. Headline, the day after the election: voters to elites, do you see me now? Not going to read the whole thing, but I want to read certain sections of this. We have entered a new political era. For the past 40 years or so, we lived in the information age. Those of us in the educated class decided, with some justification, that the post-industrial economy would be built by people like ourselves. So we tailored social policies to meet our needs. By the way, when he mentions the post-industrial economy, he leaves out the reason it's the post-industrial economy is because the government officials that you protect and do stenography for sold everybody's jobs to China, Mexico, and elsewhere. That's why it became the post-industrial economy. Didn't just happen accidentally. I digress. Our education policy pushed towards the course we followed: four-year colleges so that they would be qualified for the, quote, jobs of the future. Meanwhile, vocational training withered. We embraced a free trade policy that moved industrial jobs to low-cost countries overseas so that we could focus our energies on knowledge economy enterprises run by people with advanced degrees. The financial and consulting sector mushroomed while manufacturing employment shriveled. Yeah, what he's leaving out here is, they didn't do this free trade policy so that we could, quote, focus our energies on knowledge economy enterprises run by people with advanced degrees. They did this because the government sold out to Wall Street and allowed Wall Street and multi-international conglomerates, multi-corporate conglomerates, essentially write our free trade deals so that they can massively lower their costs by getting cheaper labor overseas. That's why we did it, not to focus our energies on knowledge economy enterprises. Okay. Geography was deemed unimportant if capital and high-skilled labor wanted to cluster in Austin, San Francisco, and Washington. It didn't really matter what happened to all those other communities left behind. Well, at least he's admitting it. Immigration policies gave highly educated people access to low-wage labor, while less skilled workers faced new competition. We shifted towards green technologies favored by people who work in pixels, and we disfavored people in manufacturing and transportation whose livelihoods depend on fossil fuels. Okay, so it's well written, and he is right for the most part. He's just right, not understanding fully. He's half right, shall we say. But now let's get to the part that is just stunning, absolutely stunning. And I'm sorry to you Bernie people. I don't want to invoke your, 2016, 2020 Bernie PTSD, but I might. This might make you lose your shit. Okay, we go on. The Democratic Party had one job: to combat inequality. Here was a great chasm of inequality right before their noses, and somehow many Democrats didn't see it. Many on the left focused on racial inequality, gender inequality, and LGBTQ inequality. I guess it's hard to focus on class inequality when you went to college with a multi-billion-dollar endowment and do environmental greenwashing and diversity seminars for a major corporation. Donald Trump is a monstrous narcissist, but there's something off about an educated class that looks in the mirror of society and sees only itself. As the left veered toward identitarian performance art, Donald Trump jumped into the class war with both feet. His Queens-born resentment of the Manhattan elites dovetailed magically with the class animosity being felt by rural people across the country. His message was simple. These people have betrayed you, and they are morons to boot. In 2024, he built the very thing the Democratic Party once tried to build, a multiracial working-class majority. His support surged among Black and Hispanic workers. He recorded astonishing gains in places like New Jersey, the Bronx, Chicago, Dallas, and Houston. According to the NBC exit polls, he won a third of voters of colors. He's the first Republican to win a majority of the votes in 20 years. Here's the kicker, folks. The Democrats obviously have to do some major rethinking. The Biden administration tried to woo the working class with subsidies and stimulus, but there is no economic solution to what is primarily a crisis of respect. We'll get back to that because this is not a crisis of respect. There will be some on the left who will say Trump won because of the inherent racism, sexism, and authoritarianism of the American people. Apparently, those people love losing and want to do it again and again and again. The rest of us need to look at this result with humility. American voters are not always wise, but they are generally sensible, and they have something to teach us. My initial thought is that I have to re-examine my own priors. I'm a moderate. I like it when Democratic candidates run to the center. But I have to confess that Harris did that pretty effectively, and it didn't work. Maybe the Democrats have to embrace a Bernie Sanders-style disruption, something that will make people like me feel uncomfortable. Let me repeat. Maybe the Democrats have to embrace a Bernie Sanders-style disruption, something that will make people like me feel uncomfortable. They say it's better late than never, but I have to say in this situation, I wish he would just shut the fuck up. Because it was the David Brooks of the world, the New York Times, the CNNs, the MSNBCs, the Chris Matthews, the Rachel Maddow, the Wolf Blitzer, Washington Post, Joy Reid. We could go down the list. Who threw their entire bodies on the scale to lie to their baby boomer audience, because frankly, the largest audience for cable news, the predominant readers of the New York Times, Washington Post are older. Now, we have plenty of older folks who watch us, but plenty of old people are with it and progressive. But by the data, most of the elite media's consumers are older people above 50. He's just realizing this now, a decade into the Bernie era, even though it's the post-Bernie era, because Bernie kind of went along with Biden. You're just realizing now that people are broke. You're just realizing now that maybe it wasn't such a great idea to completely economically hollow out entire regions of America, send their jobs to other countries. You're just realizing this now? And by the way, when he says that, let me show you this because I almost lost my mind. It's like he's almost getting it. He's almost getting it, but not quite. When he says the Biden administration tried to woo the working class with subsidies and stimulus, but there's no economic solution to what is primarily a crisis of respect. Folks, I have gone around the country for the last 8 years. I have reported from 35 states, probably at this point, 75 to 100 cities. I have interviewed at this point on camera and speaking off camera, throw out a number, probably 5,000 people. Leftists, conservatives, libertarians, wackos, tree huggers, anarchists, doesn't matter. Why Donald Trump has won twice in 8 years, and I'm sorry if you're MAGA watching, he's not going to do anything for you. He's not for the working class. He's not. He's going to do tax cuts for wealthy people and deregulation. and maybe put up half a wall. That's what you're going to get, and a lot of chaos. Why Donald Trump just cleaned the Democrats' clock? Why did Republicans took back the Senate? Is because we've had a 50-year neoliberal expansion in this country. And when I say expansion, not in a good way. We have literally had a gilded age in this country for the last 50 years. That is not being dramatic. 50 years in this country. The wealth has skyrocketed to the top. You see that line? That's the money. 229% increase to the top 1%. Bottom 90%. That's down there. That's not a crisis of respect. That's a crisis of corruption. That's a crisis of a bank robbery. All the money being stolen from the middle and the bottom to the top. That's what David Brooks and CNN and the New York Times, I don't even want to say they don't understand it, because I think they do understand it. That's what they don't want to tell the masses. That's what they don't want to tell the masses. This is not a crisis of respect. People pre-50 years ago had a decent standard of living. You didn't have to work 2 to 3 jobs. You could have 2 cars. You could take a vacation as a family. You had enough money when you retired. But the educated class that David Brooks speaks of is the government sold out to the donors behind me. We live in the United Corporations of America. The government allowed Wall Street and multinational corporations to write laws, to write trade deals that sent all the steel jobs overseas, sent all the most of the auto jobs overseas, sent all the carpentry overseas. Why do you think during COVID there was such an emergency of, we don't have ventilators, we don't have masks, we don't have this, we don't have that? Because we sent all of manufacturing, from cars to masks to ventilators, to other countries. I'm not against other countries having jobs. I mean, there's a low wage jobs, but not at the expense of our citizens. And David Brooks will not be fired for being wrong for the last 10 years. If you are a Wall Street CEO and you're routinely wrong on major things, you do lose your job. If you are on Main Street and you're a waiter, you will lose your job if you're chronically screwing up. If you're chronically screwing up people's orders, if you're chronically late to work, you'll lose your job. But if you were wrong about the Iraq war, not only will you not lose your job, you will get a promotion. You will get your own show on CNN and MSNBC. If you're routinely wrong about elections, if you're routinely wrong about voter sentiment, if you're routinely wrong about the true state of the economy and the working class, if you're routinely wrong about environmental genocide and you just report, oh, Flint is fixed, the water's fine now, which it's not. Not only will you keep your job, not only will you not lose your job, you will get more airtime. You will get more ability to write more columns. You will fail upwards, because that's what the media system is designed for. It's to have people that are inherently elitist and disconnected from the very people they are supposed to report for, the very people they're supposed to be commenting and analyzing for. There is no actual job requirement to go out into these communities consistently and take the pulse of people in the heartland, take the pulse of the working class, take the pulse, find out how people are living, find out how wages really are, how the economy really is, not looking at the stock market or GDP, but talking to people in the trenches, in Michigan, in Wisconsin, in Pennsylvania, and all over this country. You don't have to do that. In fact, you're basically disqualified from doing that. You know, I want to tell you two examples of this. You know, I remember I started at the Young Turks at the end of 2015, early 2016. And when I started there, I was sent out on the campaign trail. But instead of, traveling with the campaigns, which most of the other reporters do, meaning you're traveling with them. You're on their planes, you're on the buses, you're following the candidate. I did it independently, which was also cheaper and I think the better way. So we would just fly or drive to different states. We would go to rallies hours before they started. We would, go around town and interview people. I didn't have to be at the mercy of the candidate's schedule. So when we would go to rallies in Iowa or New Hampshire or name your town or city where they were having primaries, I would go into the crowd on the ground, into the crowd and interview, 10, 15 voters before and after Bernie went on stage or Trump went on stage. I would always look back at the press stage. That's, the big riser where journalists and anchors stand. I was literally the only one in the crowd interviewing voters. 9 out of 10 times, 10 out of 10 times. There was no other reporters in the crowd speaking with voters. They were literally standing on the press stage, looking down at their phones, tweeting or on the phone, doing whatever. Now, they would say, well, that's because we're traveling with the candidate. And the candidate usually shows up 10 minutes before the rally, so we don't have time. You could say whatever you want. News outlets have choices. They could send their reporters not following the candidate. They could send their reporters independently, like I was doing, to go talk to voters, to go to diners, to go to malls, to show up to rallies 2 hours early, to stay after rallies an hour later and interview voters. They choose not to because they want access to the candidate. So it was always stunning to me. I would look back and I wish I had told my cameraman at the time, I did actually. I remember that. Show the press. The people that they're supposed to be covering, the issues that they're supposed to be covering, they're literally looking down on the voters. They're not in the crowd interviewing voters. That is why I early on felt and later knew Hillary was going to lose because I could see the voter sentiment. And that is why I knew that why Trump was going to win was because he was pushing NAFTA so hard. He was pushing anti-NAFTA so hard. NAFTA obviously was the trade deal that sent so many auto and steel and other manufacturing jobs offshore. So he had them at NAFTA. The people in these crowds in Michigan, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, he had them because he was speaking their language. But the reporters behind me didn't understand that because they weren't on the ground talking to the voters. I was. The second example I want to tell you, this was just stunning. As you know, or if you're new to Status Coup, I've covered the Flint water crisis and cover-up extensively. I have a new book out. It's called We the Poisoned, Exposing the Flint Water Cover-Up. If you haven't gotten it yet, check it out. It's on Amazon, Barnes & Noble, online. There's also an audio version. So I remember crystally clear. I mean, part of the problem with Flint has been I've broken story after story about the cover-up, trying to get the media to care because the media abandoned this story 8 years ago. They don't care anymore. They just report whatever the EPA and the government says. The government and the EPA says the water's fine. They just regurgitate it. The water's not fine. So a resident called me a couple weeks ago or a couple months ago and told me, I just had a reporter leave my house in tears. I said, oh, what happened? I'm not going to name names, but a reporter for one of the largest outlets in Michigan, one of the largest newspapers in Michigan, who that reporter was that newspaper's reporter covering the Flint water crisis for the last 6 years. That reporter for that newspaper, that was one of their top beats, as they call it, the Flint water crisis. The resident essentially tore into the reporter because that newspaper had just been regurgitating what the state of Michigan tells them, which was just propaganda and bullshit. That reporter had just literally been regurgitating state propaganda, never speaking with the residents, never digging, never investigating. And that reporter, speaking with the resident, heard things that they had never known before. And that reporter apologized and expressed, this is my first time actually reporting in Flint. That reporter had been working at that outlet for over 5 years. And that reporter was their lead reporter on the Flint water crisis. After 5 years, this was their first time reporting in Flint in a resident's home. That is scandalous. Now, this was a major newspaper that has a lot of resources. this was a reporter that lives in Michigan that could go to Flint pretty easily whenever they wanted to. They had never gone into Flint to talk to residents. No wonder you simply regurgitate what the state and the EPA tell you, because you're not in people's homes like I have been. You're not there 21 times like I have been. And I'm not from Michigan. I have flown and driven to Flint 21 times. I don't say this so you clap for us, but please do support us as a paying member. StatusCoup.com/join. We need to grow our paid membership if we want to continue. We need to grow if we want to hire other reporters, producers, travel more, cover more stories. We are not going to be the anti-Trump resistance. We will cover the Trump presidency, of course, but we're not going to do it 24/7 like everyone else, which probably would be more profitable for us. But we believe there's a reason we got Trump. We need to cover all the other stories the rest of the corporate and, frankly, most independent media routinely ignore. How is it that you are the lead reporter covering the Flint water crisis, but you have never reported in Flint? Make that make sense. And I could go down the list. I have so many examples. I'll probably write a book one day of the media who make millions of, when I'm talking about the media, I'm talking about $1 million anchors, reporters who make nearly $1 million, pundits who have contracts on CNN and MSNBC that get hundreds of thousands of dollars to go on CNN and MSNBC a couple times a week to bloviate. These people never actually go into the communities they are supposed to be reporting on, reporting about, analyzing, offering, or delivering to their viewers who are mostly older. What is the actual state of the economy? What is the actual state of workers? What is the state of people's wages? How are people's standard of life? They don't go. I can't get in their head why they don't go. I have a few guesses, but they don't actually go into communities. They sit in newsrooms in New York, in DC, in LA. They take calls from government officials, from the Biden administration or the Trump administration. Those officials usually spin them. And then those anchors and reporters report as breaking news, spin that they're delivered from campaign and government officials. I worked at Fox and MSNBC. I could tell you that's how it works because I saw it. So on one end, you could say, well, at least David Brooks in the New York Times is seeing it now. But on the other end, David Brooks, I don't know off the top of my head. My guess is he's probably makes for the New York Times between the New York Times, books, speaking fees, because he speaks, he writes books. My guess is he makes a few $1 million a year. Is there no actual penalty for being wrong constantly? Do you not have to have any, is there no actual scoreboard in terms of being an anchor or being a reporter or being a pundit or being a columnist? Sure. The point is, Jordan, you could say devil's advocate, Jordan, it's opinion. They're giving their opinions. So of course you could be wrong. Right. But when you're consistently wrong about things that are life or death, when you're consistently wrong about things that could lead to fascism, when you're consistently wrong about things that could lead to wars, when you're consistently wrong about things that are about communities being poisoned, shouldn't there at some point be a reckoning? Shouldn't there at some point be punishment? Shouldn't you lose your job? And I'm not someone who calls for people to be fired lightly. People have families and mortgages to pay and children to feed. And I'm not just willy-nilly saying fire them. But at a certain point, these people smeared, not just Bernie Sanders. This isn't about Bernie Sanders. These people smeared Bernie and Nina Turner and Bernie Bros and progressives. These people said, oh, they're socialists. Oh, their policies are unpopular. Oh, they'll lose to Trump. Oh, they're racist. Oh, they're misogynist. This, that, and the other thing. When now they're literally saying, oh, yeah, maybe actually, maybe actually. But I have to confess, maybe the Democrats have to embrace a Bernie Sanders style disruption, something that will make people like me feel uncomfortable. Well, you don't say. And by the way, I'm going to do another video on this later. As CNN and MSNBC and the New York Times, the Washington Post flood you with pundits and strategists and consultants telling you, no, the reason the Democratic Party lost is because they're too woke, or they embrace cancel culture, or they snicker down on working class people. That's not why they lost in 2016. And that's not why they lost in 2024. And that's not an opinion. That's the data. The exit polls clearly show 75% of voters said inflation had severely or moderately impacted them. 67% of voters, all voters, said their economic condition is worse off compared to 4 years ago. You cannot win an election if 75% of the voters are saying the rent is too damn high, the groceries are too damn high, the gas is too damn high. And it's not just that prices are too high now. It's the cumulative effect of neoliberal gentrification, neoliberal economics, neoliberal market fundamentalism. It's the cumulative effect of all of these things. It's not because, I was tweeting with someone that, that trans ad that Trump did, where he said, Kamala's for they, them. He's for you. Did that have an effect? Was it effective? Yes. There's a difference between an ad or an argument being effective at it being the core reason someone wins or loses. Kamala Harris embracing they, them. By the way, that policy that they were talking about in that ad happened under the Trump presidency. Most people might not know that. But that's not why people lost. It's that they were already at a fundamental level economically frustrated and fed up. They were already at a fundamentally baseline level. The prices are too high. Not just groceries, not just gas. Housing is expensive. Insurance is expensive. Healthcare is expensive. Utility bills is expensive. And not just for millennials and Gen Z, Gen X, even baby boomers I have messaging me all the time. So when you're already economically frustrated, destitute, or hopeless, when you're already at a baseline, just treading water, those secondary things like an ad, blaming the trans people or blaming the immigrants, that is effective, but it's not the core reason. It's almost like a revolt vote. Like the Democratic Party has been giving me empty promises, empty promises, empty promises. They've been running on, we're going to pass the $15 minimum wage. And then, as soon as Biden becomes president, we can't do it. The parliamentarian says so. Oh, Biden runs on a public option. I'll never mention it again. Abandon that. Oh, Biden runs on $2,000 checks. Here's a $1,400 check. Oh, Biden passes a bunch of good things in the COVID relief bill, like a child tax credit, but only sets it for 1 year and then allows it to expire and won't fight Joe Manchin and Kirsten Sinema, who are apparently, they might not be. It might just be the Democratic Party didn't want to do it, or the donors didn't want to do it any further, and they just blame Manchin and Sinema. But Biden didn't use the bully pulpit of the presidency to fight Kirsten Sinema or Joe Manchin. He could have used the bully pulpit of the presidency to tar, feather, and shame these two obstructionists for blocking kids from eating. Because I got news for you. If Biden would have passed the $15 minimum wage, if Democrats would have passed the $15 minimum wage, which is not enough, to be clear, but it's better than the starvation wage of $7.25 federally. If Biden would have passed an extension of the child tax credit, my strong suspicion is, despite inflation, they would have won. Harris would have won. Because those are structurally big deals, increasing the minimum wage like that. And those are actually things you could run on, not small ball tax credits, but passing a $15 minimum wage, a child tax credit of, that brought poverty down. And people, it's not just messaging, it's policy that people feel. It's policy that people feel. Because with inflation, having that child tax credit lowered the harm of inflation for a lot of working class people. With inflation, that $15 minimum wage makes it a little easier. But also, there were things Biden could have done on inflation, which I have repeatedly said. JFK in 1962, when the U.S. Steel, the massive steel company, was price gouging on steel, you know what he did? He said, hey, you got till the end of the week to lower the prices on steel. If you don't, I'm pulling the contracts for U.S. submarines. So we're not going to allow you to build the steel for U.S. submarines. We're going to give it to other companies that aren't price gouging. U.S. Steel folded like a cheap tent. Biden could have called, instead of sending harshly worded letters to the oil companies asking them, please, please, pretty please lower prices. Biden could have held a press conference and said to the American people, we give $15 billion a year. $15 billion a year in federal subsidies to the fossil fuel industry. If they don't lower gas prices by the end of the week to be proportionate where the price of oil actually is, we're going to pull those subsidies. Could have done the same thing for agriculture, the grocery system, pharma. We could go down the list. He's not going to do this because the donors don't want him to. The donors are controlling America, folks. They're controlling Biden. They would have been controlling Harris, and they certainly control Trump, despite his bravado and tough talk. Donald Trump ran on draining the swamp. Who did he name as his Secretary of State? Rex Tillerson, the former head of ExxonMobil. Draining the swamp. He appointed Gary Cohn as or Steve Mnuchin as his Treasury Secretary. Steve Mnuchin was a predatory Wall Street douchebag who helped illegally foreclose on people. And Kamala Harris could have prosecuted him and didn't. I mean, I could go on and on. But at a certain point, I've been saying for years, it's one thing, it's fine. Yes, protest outside BlackRock, protest outside the White House, protest outside, the EPA, protest outside Citibank. But why are we letting the media off the hook? Why are there not mass protests outside the New York Times for routinely lying us into wars, for routinely smearing the only working class candidates out there, for routinely not only smearing, but lying about them to the American people? Why is there not hundreds, if not thousands of people outside CNN when they're pushing this Bernie bro bullshit constantly? Why are there not hundreds, if not thousands of people outside of CNN or MSNBC when they're pushing propaganda and lying about Israeli genocide of Palestinians? I'm not saying be violent. No violence. That's not what I'm talking about. Peaceful resistance. They can't ignore hundreds of thousands of people outside their doors. Why are the David Brooks of the world allowed to be so comfortable in their ivory tower when they're routinely wrong? It's one thing if you're occasionally wrong. I'm wrong occasionally. No one is perfect. It's another thing if, as a job, your entire mindset does not match reality. I want to read a thread that I wrote this morning, not, to pat myself on the back, but just because it's easier to just read it. Because I think it kind of crystallizes everything I'm saying here. And I hope you'll follow along with me. Again, I'm not saying this to pat myself on the back here, but it's just easier to read my thoughts as I wrote them. And this is on Twitter. Or X or whatever this hellscape calls itself now. As a response to New York Times David Brooks' great awakening that he's been wrong on Bernie progressives for a decade, can all political sides finally have this reckoning? From the Wall Street CEO to the Main Street waiter, if you're chronically wrong or severely screw up your job, you lose it. But since the 1980s, and 90s, our public information infrastructure, the mainstream media, has been purchased by multi-billion-dollar corporate conglomerates who all spend hundreds of millions on lobbying the same government officials they're supposed to be holding accountable, who not only keep on the payroll anchors, reporters, and pundits who are repeatedly wrong on politics, voter sentiment, state of the economy, as a result of their wealth and class, are completely disconnected from the very Americans they're paid to report and comment for, are not only routinely wrong, but routinely misstate facts, also known as lie, to the American public about everything from the state of the economy, government corruption, environmental genocide, i.e. Flint, East Palestine. As part of their jobs, from anchors to reporters to producers to pundits to news executives, rarely travel outside of New York City, Washington, D.C., or Los Angeles to the areas they are paid millions to report on and offer opinions on. And when corporate journalists do leave their coastal bubbles to Midwest or poorer areas, it's almost always as part of a campaign coverage or on a breaking news disaster they parachute in and out of. $1 million anchors and reporters are not embedded in working class poor communities. And then I give the examples that I gave you earlier about having never seen reporters on the campaign trail actually in the crowd at rallies interviewing voters, and about the Michigan reporter who was supposed to be reporting on the Flint water crisis, but apparently never went to Flint to talk to any Flint residents in the 5 years they reported. The thread is longer. If you want to read it, I'll put it in the description. Folks, I named this company Status Coup. Thank you, Chris Garrett, came up with the idea for these awesome polos. I named the company Status Coup because I believe the status quo in this country largely exists. Yes, because of the donors, the corporations, the corruption. But I believe the reason we have such a rotten, corrupt status quo, 60 to 70% of it is the gatekeepers. The gatekeepers to what's actually going on are CNN, MSNBC, the New York Times, the Washington Post, name your outlets. They're not as big and prevalent as they used to be, but they're still, for better or worse, the gatekeepers, particularly to the most reliable voters, which are sadly older voters. Again, not all older voters are misinformed. Not all older voters are selfish. A lot of them are progressive, leftist, working class, whatever, and with it and get it, many of whom watch us. I named it Status Coup because we need a journalistic, not a violent, a journalistic coup d'etat of the status quo. And that means we need to counteract and debunk the propaganda coming from the corporate media. If the working class has any chance in this country, we need to wake up the masses to what's really going on. We need to wake up to the masses to the fact that the economy has not been good for 40 years, that you are being robbed. Your money is being stolen by the elite. I showed you the chart already. We'll continue to do that. I hope if you appreciate this reporting, if you appreciate this truth, you will help us do it. We are the only independent outlet that I know of, that is routinely on the ground across America. We just got back from a 10-day, 3-state swing state reporting trip. We were in Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin for 10 days. It cost us a lot of money. I was on the ground in Philly on election night. Tina Desiree Berg was on the ground in Las Vegas. That cost a lot of money. We were live. You might have not seen it because there was a lot of bigger channels that were live too. But we were the only ones on the ground talking to voters. All of this costs a lot of money. All I need from you is $5 to $10 a month. $5 to $10 a month. That's what it costs to become a Status Coup member. We do monthly members calls. We're doing our monthly members call next week. It's through a program like Zoom. I take questions, comments. We usually go for an hour or two. Please support us if you can, because frankly, if we don't start really, really defeating, not violently, but just getting rid of the David Brooks of the world and reaching the people we need to reach with the truth, not much is going to change.